Welcome to Digital Dungeons, taking your tabletop role-playing game online in the age of COVID-19. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad your epic quest has brought you here, and I'm pleased to have so many promising adventurers joining us today. My name is Justin Johnston. I've presented at events such as MAGFest and Awesome Con for 4 years. I'm an IT consultant as well as a professional DM and DM advisor. On Twitter, I'm at Radio Free Gamer, and I'm available at radiofreegamer@gmail.com if you have any questions pertaining to the presentation today. Before I get started, I have a few acknowledgements. First off, thanks to Peter and his team at Left Field Media for coordinating this event and for letting me be a part of it. It's a shame that Awesome Con has been postponed, but thanks for putting this together, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to present at Epic Quest. And thanks to my good friends at Content Productions for their help recording and getting such an amazing quality setup. I really appreciate all your help. And finally, thanks to everyone on the Behind the Screens subreddit Discord chat for submitting their thoughts and questions on the subject of online D&D, particularly during COVID-19. We'll get to those over the course of this discussion. Now, we're here today to discuss taking D&D into the virtual space in light of COVID. Those of you who have played both in person and online will be familiar with the differences between the two. I had a group which played in person for several years before going online due to players moving across the country. It was my first regular group ever since getting into the hobby back in 2nd edition AD&D in middle school. So we really wanted to keep the game going, and we had to adjust to online play. We used different virtual tabletops, different chat softwares, but the important thing was that it was an iterative process, and our group was open to change and discussing what worked and what didn't. I'll speak to some of the items that worked and some of the lessons that we learned. Initially, I wanted to do a top 10 tips and tools presentation, but that doesn't do the current situation justice. COVID is so pervasive that it has changed how my group and I play D&D, and in speaking with others on Discord and Reddit, I found this to hold true for them as well. So rather than give you my top 10 tips and tools for online D&D, my goal in this talk is to equip you to have conversations with your group, both to facilitate a transition to online play, as well as to understand how COVID may have changed why and how you play D&D. This talk will focus on 3 main subjects of conversation with your group: logistics and planning, the personal impacts of COVID on your group, and techniques for DMs and players during a session. As you prepare for these discussions with your group, there are a few key questions I'd ask you to consider. The first, what assumptions am I making? This could be assumptions about accessibility to equipment such as webcams, accessibility to virtual tabletops, about people's circumstances during COVID, and so on. The second, and equally important, what can I control? About distractions, players being able to attend sessions, and so on. Asking yourself these questions will help you manage your expectations as you take your game online. With all that in mind, let's get started. Now, before I can begin our conversation about logistics and planning, I'd like to examine how online games are fundamentally different from in-person games. There are many considerations which only apply to one or the other, and it's important to understand these differences before we begin our discussion. I'd also like to define what I mean by logistics so we're all on the same page. When I say logistics, I mean everything that the group has to plan for outside of actual gameplay. This includes where the game will play, how people will access materials such as source books, character sheets, maps, and so on, when and how long will the group play. I also want to make it clear that it's not just the DM's responsibility to do the planning, and that it's important for the group to discuss this all together and decide what works for everyone. I've found there are fewer logistical considerations to be made for in-person play, with the exception of transportation, travel time, and parking. I'm from the DC area, so I know the reality of spending 45 minutes to get to a session of D&D. I don't want to count that out. But when you consider how simple it is to share source books when you're in person, or to see maps, or view character sheets, or even share dice if someone forgot to bring theirs, it can be daunting to think of how you will make all those materials accessible online. Think of it, something as essential to the game as rolling dice can become more complicated when you're playing online. And yes, there are certainly tools which we can use to make that aspect of the game easier, but it's important to consider how much of the game changes when you take it online. Another important consideration is that when you take your game online, you lose out on the shared space and everything that goes along with it. When you're face to face with your group, it's easier to manage distractions. It's much easier to tell when one person is on their phone or otherwise not paying attention to the game. And it's much easier to manage ambient distractions since you can choose a quiet place to play. So as you take your game online, there are a number of logistical questions which must be addressed. How will the group access source books? How will the DM access the group's character sheets? How will the group share dice rolls? How will you communicate both in and out of the game? When and for how long will the group play? My goal is to prepare you to discuss each of these questions with your group. I'll equip you with different possibilities for each, and you can search for your own options as well. As you prepare for and carry out these discussions, it's important to be open to what your group has to say and to understand and try to accommodate their needs. It's fine to make changes to your setup once you have it in place, and to have further discussions in the future about what works and what doesn't. Regarding source books, it's possible that everyone in your group already has the source books they need, whether it's just the player's handbook or any of the numerous 5th edition supplements which have been published over the last few years. And if so, great. If that isn't the case, and there are people in your group who don't have access to source books, there are options. Remember though, COVID has had a tremendous financial impact on a lot of people. There are free rule sets for 5th edition, which are available both as a PDF from the Wizards of the Coast webpage and on D&D Beyond. These rules are more limited in terms of the options you'll have to create your characters, but it's a good way to get your group started and to see if you want to invest further if you're enjoying the game. I've also been in groups where we've chipped in to buy someone a player's handbook. With digital versions of the PHB available on multiple platforms, including Roll20 and D&D Beyond, there are budget-friendly and COVID-friendly options to be found. To go on a brief tangent about D&D Beyond, because I'll be mentioning it quite a bit, I found it an incredibly useful resource for me and my group, both when playing in person or online. The platform itself is free, and it allows for players to create a digital character from the basic rule set, which I mentioned earlier. Players can also purchase digital content, including the player's handbook and other source books, and have it available immediately to use and give them expanded character creation options. They will be able to access items such as new classes, subclasses, spells, feats, items, and so on. And when they're creating their characters, they will see all those laid out in a very accessible form. One of the more powerful tools I found on D&D Beyond is the content sharing option. Users who opt for the $6 a month master tier subscription can share all their purchased source books with their group, which means that one person could buy a player's handbook and a supplement like Xanathar's Guide to Everything on their master tier account and share it with up to 5 groups of 12 players each. As long as they create a campaign in D&D Beyond and enable content sharing, then you and your party members will be able to access all the content that you've purchased. If your group is able to access D&D Beyond either on a computer or on mobile, this can be pretty cost effective, especially for larger groups. Now, if the group just wants to play or is just starting out and trying the game, you could also consider cutting out source books altogether and using pre-made character sheets. If you do this as a DM, I'd recommend being careful about committing to managing your group's character sheets longer than a few sessions, as it can be quite a lot of work. I'd also recommend sharing D&D tutorial videos, such as the excellent How to Play Dungeons & Dragons 5e series on the YouTube channel Don't Stop Thinking. While we're on the subject, consider how your group will share and update character sheets. I'm already getting nostalgic for paper character sheets that are covered in eraser marks and notes. And as a DM, it's not easy to check whether my players have filled out their character sheets correctly when we aren't all around a table. One of the more accessible options to combat this is to continue using paper character sheets and just text or email pictures to the DM so that they can check it. Another would be to use PDF character sheets and store them somewhere like Dropbox or Google Drive so you can always see the latest version. D&D Beyond is another great option to share character sheets. As long as everyone is in the same campaign, the DM will be able to see their character sheets and access their features and spells more quickly during a session, which I find is really helpful. If you're a DM, I would recommend getting into a rhythm where you're checking character sheets and making sure your players keep them up to date, especially after your party levels up in a session. I would recommend giving your players reminders or asking them to make edits a day or two prior to the next session so you have time to review and suggest changes. Though remember, D&D isn't necessarily people's top priority right now, and you may have some rushed character sheets that were made right before a session. I try not to take this personally, and I know that can be difficult sometimes, but priorities, it's all right. It's not on you. Most of what I've discussed up until now has been applicable both for in-person and online D&D games. But dice rolling is another matter. Consider how important dice are to the game of D&D. People have entire rituals around dice. Some players have different dice for each character they play. Some make dice jails when a particular set of dice misbehaves and rolls poorly. There's a certain magic that happens at the table when an important roll hangs in the air and you don't know the outcome. You don't have to lose that when you play online. I'm fairly permissive in my games, so I'm fine with my players rolling however they want, because I want to maintain those rituals around dice rolling. Some of my players choose to roll physical dice and tell me the results. I don't make them roll on camera, except for maybe when we're rolling stats. So that means, yes, they may fudge rolls sometimes. But guess what? I also fudge rolls as the DM. Personally, I'm fine losing that aspect of control, so long as I don't notice that any one player always rolls well when they need to. With all that said, there are other options for sharing dice rolls. I use Discord with most of my groups, and there are a number of excellent Discord plugins such as Avray and Rodbot, which allow players to roll dice and share their results. Avray also just introduced a new feature where you can import a D&D Beyond character into Discord via Avray, allowing players to import their characters and make rolls directly in the Discord chat. I found it a bit clunky, but if your group is more technically inclined, then it could be a good option. Roll20 is also a great dice roller, especially if you're using that for your virtual tabletop. I'll get into Roll20 and other virtual tabletop platforms shortly. There are other dice rollers for people who have access to a smartphone or a computer. Google has a basic dice roller built into its platform if you just Google dice roller. And there are numerous dice rolling apps for the smartphone. The takeaway here is that there are all kinds of tools for rolling dice, and going online doesn't have to completely kill the mystique of dice rolling. If you're a DM, some of the questions worth asking around this are whether or not you're fine seeing your party's rolls all the time, and whether or not you need everyone to roll dice in the same way or on the same platform, such as Roll20 or Discord, to make running the game easier. Keep those questions in mind and have those answers ready when you're discussing dice rolling with your group. As far as communication outside of a game, coordinating with your players can be extremely important, especially during COVID. I'll get into some techniques for communication later, but for now I'd like to focus on possible choices for a communication platform. This is going to be highly subjective for each group. Usually the most accessible choices are communicating via text or email. That presents a lower barrier of entry where, as long as you have a phone or an email address, you can be an active part of a conversation. I've also used Discord, Google Hangouts, and Facebook Chat. I don't even know if Google Hangouts is still a thing, honestly. My favorite, though, is Discord because of @mentions being pretty powerful and for file sharing. Regarding planning the actual session, I prefer to set a regular day and time, be it weekly or every other week. This helps maintain some sense of regularity during COVID, and honestly, sometimes I just need something to look forward to every week. If that isn't possible, I typically go to Doodle to set up polls, which allow each group member to indicate when they are free and when they're not. It cuts down on a huge amount of back and forth during planning, and it easily lets me see when people are free. Now, when we've chosen a date, I always follow up with a calendar invite. Trust me, that just makes having that little reminder a little bit more effective. Regarding communication during a game, this was one of the areas where I had more of a problem with how most of the top 10 style videos for online D&D were presented. In many cases, they were picturing an ideal setup where each player had adequate lighting, an HD webcam, a computer to use uninterrupted for the duration of the session, stable internet that could support video calls, a headset, minimal distractions. Remember the questions guiding our conversation today. What am I assuming? Well, we can't assume what resources our players will and won't have access to. It's important to understand what your players do have available to them before you, as a group, make a decision on the platform you'll use for communication during a session. Computers and spaces in the home may need to be shared now that people are staying home due to COVID. Internet connections may be under more stress due to multiple people streaming, and video chat may not be as smooth for some people. Microphones might pick up more background noise. There's a lot to consider. I'll go through options which have worked well in the past for me, but the most important takeaway is to make sure that this is a conversation with the group, where the priority is to understand what does and doesn't work for each individual and to make an informed decision together as to how you'll play. And as you experiment with different options, remember that some may work better than others, and it's okay to change it up. Now, I'll start with the most obvious: webcams. Speaking from personal experience, it can be really hard to get into the session as a DM if I can't see my players' faces. I can't read them as easily. I can't tell when someone wants to speak, and it reinforces the fact that we aren't all sitting together at a table. It's a huge bummer, and I'm fine requesting that players use a webcam, even if it's just on their phone, but I'm not comfortable demanding that they use a webcam. And that's a question that you can ask yourself before you come into the conversation. If a player doesn't have access to a webcam, or isn't comfortable using a webcam, or is in a shared space where they can't use a webcam, then I would consider being more lenient and not asking them to. With that out of the way, I'd like to discuss different platforms which I've used for online games. If a group member has access to an enterprise account through their job for a platform such as Microsoft Teams, WebEx, or Google Meet, those typically tend to be more stable, and they have the bonus of allowing players to dial in via phone if needed. I've also used free video chat apps such as Discord, Zoom, and the non-enterprise version of Google Meet, which typically lack the ability to dial in via phone, but they have smartphone apps which work pretty well. My preference is typically to use Discord video chat, especially if your group is already using Discord for out-of-game communication. But Google Meet is also great since it has screen sharing and because you can add a conference link directly to a Google Calendar invite. If your group uses maps for exploration or for combat during play, then I'd recommend looking into a virtual tabletop such as Roll20, Fantasy Grounds, Astral Tabletop, or Tabletop Simulator. I don't have enough time to dive into the pros and cons of each, but Roll20 is my recommendation as you can get a lot of functionality out of it from a free account. Paid subscriptions are also available for things like dynamic lighting, which is great for dungeon crawls. As far as the setup that I use, my current groups typically use D&D Beyond to host character sheets and share content. We have a Discord chat that we use for our out-of-game communication, and during a session, we'll have a call in Google Meet. Typically, someone will share their screen to show Roll20 to everyone. The whole group can see it. It's really helpful. Most of the players will be in Roll20 and will roll dice in Roll20, but a few roll in person. That was a mouthful. I'm realizing now how complicated that all sounds, but my point is that there are options to accommodate everyone, so find what works. With logistics out of the way, I wanted to make sure we spend time focusing on the impacts COVID has had not only on our personal lives, but why we play D&D. Personally, D&D is one of the few social outlets that I have available to me during COVID. I'm not going to shows. I'm not seeing people as frequently as I normally do. And it's important to remember that when planning a session, I typically will need to set aside 15 or 20 minutes just for the group to chat at the start of it. And I don't want to take that away from them or rush into the session. As for some of my friends, there are some who work in the medical field, and for them, D&D has become more important as an outlet because of increased stress at work. Others are going through unemployment, and D&D is an important connection to normalcy. Some are looking for a way to stay occupied during COVID and are using D&D as an opportunity to try something new. Consider that for some people in your group, the reason they play D&D might have changed during COVID. It is worth taking an opportunity to check in with everyone and have a new session 0 to discuss what they want to get out of your game. It also may be a chance to adjust the tone or the themes of your game. For instance, giving the players more agency and letting them set the pace in a session. Also consider that some players may be more sensitive to certain themes right now, given the general landscape. Themes such as loneliness, isolation, oppression, abuse of authority, atmospheric dread, or plagues. I don't know why you would have a campaign focusing on plagues right now, but yeah. Or alternatively, your group could want to engage more with these themes as a coping mechanism. You never know, and it's worth talking about it. Another personal consideration is availability. Check-ins have become much more important to me as part of my session prep. I'll typically ping everyone in the Discord chat the day of a session to see how they're doing and whether they can attend. It's important to remember people's situations can change drastically from day to day. It may be that they saw half their coworkers get fired that day, or someone close to them had a health scare. People will drop out of sessions the day of. It's okay, and it's out of your control. It is okay to text people and follow up if they haven't said whether or not they're available to play. And if people do drop out, it's good to have an understanding with the group as to whether or not you'll play if everyone can't make it. Typically for my groups, if more than 2 people are out, then we'll reschedule. I'm totally fine taking that time that we plan for a session and doing something else, like playing a video game or just chatting over drinks. I also try to be respectful of the boundaries we've set regarding when we'll play and how late a session will run. Because we're not driving to the session, because most of my players are parents and have to put their kids to bed, our sessions run later now. They typically run from about 8 p.m. to 10:30. And I know that if I go past 10:30, I will drag and the session will suffer for it, especially if I'm running it. I try not to push it too late and to respect the time boundaries we've set as a group. It's tempting to run longer, but remember that you set that window for a reason, and it's okay to respect and end things when it's done. When it comes to playing D&D online, my best advice is to manage distractions as best you can. Remember that you can only do so much to keep people engaged, especially when they're sitting in front of their computers or their phones. They're in their home. They have pets, roommates, family members, and partners sharing the same space. There's a lot contending for your players' attention during a session. I usually combat that by doing what I call a cue. A cue is a technique for prompting a player to give input with the goal of refocusing their attention on the game. It consists of 3 parts. First, I will refer to a player by their character's name clearly and wait for a response. Based on the swiftness of that response, it's easy to tell who has and who hasn't been paying attention. Then I'll give them a quick summary of the situation, and I'll give them a specific prompt for input. For instance, Aaron, and this is where you'll get a yes or a yes. And that's when you know. Aaron, the guardian automaton has asked your group for identification. It holds its armored hand out at you expectantly. What do you do? And you'll know pretty quickly whether or not they've been paying attention. And with that prompt, they have a gateway to jump back into gameplay. If your group is comfortable with this sort of thing, you can also use this as a chance to have them drive the action in a scene by having them add elements to it. For instance, Chakul. As your friends go to the bar for another round of ale, a stranger sitting in the corner of the tavern catches your eye. What are they doing that draws your interest? Remember, the goal is to gently encourage players to participate and not to call them out. Giving them a specific prompt and letting them add their own flair to a scene can help bring them back into a game without punishing them for getting distracted. Another difficult point I've encountered during online D&D is keeping players engaged during combat. Combat in D&D can sometimes be a slog, especially when you aren't at the table with everyone else, feeling that energy, feeling the tension and the excitement when someone crits. I use a system similar to cues when I'm in combat by telling players that they're on deck or in the hole. Those are terms that come from baseball. To be on deck means that you're batting next, and in the hole means that you're batting after the person who's on deck. So it's a way of telling my combatants when they're coming up. The expectation that I try to set with them is that they should plan their move when I tell them that they're on deck or in the hole. And I try to be consistent with reminding them of the turn order every turn in combat. If players consistently get to their turn and they don't know what they're going to do, then I take an opportunity privately to remind them afterwards why I'm asking them to prep their moves. It's not about punishing them, it's about keeping combat moving and keeping everyone engaged. I'll typically also group monsters together if they're alike, for instance, lower level goblin mobs. That way they can all roll their attacks together without taking up too much time. I'll also note player armor class at the beginning of the first combat in each session, so I don't have to ask them whether or not an attack roll will hit. I'll also mention the type of damage so that players can tell me whether or not they're resistant. For all you bear totem barbarians out there. You can also consider grouping rolls together so that players roll to hit and damage at the same time if they're savvy enough to keep doing that. I'm quicker to fudge combat rolls during a session. I prefer not to go back and forth on rules during combat, and I will typically err in the favor of the player unless they're really trying to pull a fast one on me. My priority is to keep the game moving, and I'm fine reviewing the rules after the session to make a more informed decision going forward. Another point is I do notice that combat tends to get samey when playing online, especially when you're just going around the turn order again and again until the enemies are dead. To get around this, I'll have a few events planned which trigger at the end of certain rounds. For instance, at the end of the first round of combat, a beam in the ceiling might collapse, requiring certain players to make a dexterity saving throw, or a fire might break out, damaging players on the back lines. This changes the dynamic in combat and makes one round different from another one. Another general issue I've found when running online games is that I tend to rush players along. Because I'm not there at the table with them, it can be harder for me to tell if they're enjoying a particular scene and want to stay in it. If the players are interacting with you and with each other, role playing, making jokes, and generally having fun, I don't see any reason to rush it. Let the action come to its conclusion, address any questions that the characters might have asked, and then move along to the next scene. Additionally, if your players are enjoying themselves where they are, feel free to add extra elements to the room, or, like I said earlier, to prompt the players for their own input into a scene so that they can add new elements, new characters, or just develop the scene further. If the players are enjoying their time in a tavern, or joking with an NPC, or more likely at the expense of an NPC, if your players are like mine, then let them have at it. Now, we've discussed quite a lot, and I hope you've gotten some information that will be useful for you and for your group. We've discussed logistics for planning your session, how to have conversations with people about D&D and what they need from it at the moment, and we've discussed tips for running and participating in a session online during COVID. Now, this is the point in a presentation where I would usually turn to the attendees for some Q&A. Unfortunately, I can't do that with you, but I did get some excellent questions from Discord. Thanks again to everyone on the D&D Behind the Screen Discord chat for their questions and comments. First off, thanks to Martian95 for bringing up player distractions. This is what prompted me to talk about how I do cues in particular. One item that I find very helpful is that if you measure when players respond to you and when you ask them a question, how long it takes, that's typically a good measure of whether or not they're really paying attention. You can also see if they have a very bright screen that says they might be on Reddit or email or something, and then when you say their name, they alt-tab, and suddenly their screen's a lot darker, their face is a lot darker. It's kind of a dead giveaway. Doesn't mean they're not paying attention, but I would like as a DM for them to stay focused on the D&D window. And thanks as well for pointing out that you can do listening parties on Spotify through Discord, which is an awesome way to share music. Music is a huge part of my D&D experience. It really helps me get into the mood. I was listening to my fantasy D&D playlist, which is basically The Witcher and Pillars of Eternity when I was making this presentation. Having that music ready can really get me into the headspace for playing D&D, and Discord offers a great tool where you can have other people listen on Spotify as long as you have a Spotify subscription, so it's really cool. Thanks to Hair Bear Hero, the usernames are so strong, for bringing up that it's difficult to have sidebar conversations when you're playing online. Now, if you have a huge group, if you have 10 people at a big table and they have sidebar conversations about what they want to do, or if you have a more junior player who's sitting next to a more experienced buddy who's explaining to them what the rules are and giving them quick clarifications on how things work and what to roll, it's harder to do that online because you only have one voice channel and you hear each other whenever you talk. So that makes it complicated if some players want to, say, solve a puzzle while the others role play. It's worth experimenting with at your table. Perhaps you have sidebar conversations in the Discord chat while the rest of you are using the voice channel to actively participate in the sessions. It also helps with those kinds of rules conversations. Like I said, if you have someone who's a rules buddy, then it makes it a lot more streamlined when you have a newer player. They can ask questions to their buddy, and it makes things a lot quicker. Thanks to Pally Guy for bringing up how they combat distractions at the table by keeping up their pace. By setting a pace themselves as the DM, they can maybe help keep people more in touch with what's going on, more engaged. And I think that can be certainly helpful, especially during combat. I had all those thoughts about increasing your efficiency during combat. But I would caution about rushing the party too much when they're in a scene that they're enjoying. Like I said, if your players are all participating in a scene at a tavern, great. Keep it there for as long as it takes for the action to naturally conclude. But if you're noticing that maybe two people are kind of dominating the conversation with NPCs at the tavern while the rest of the people zone out, maybe you can give them a prompt or you can just move action along. So that's everything that I had to discuss today. Thanks again. I hope you all have a wonderful and a successful and an epic weekend with Epic Quest. Good luck to everyone in finishing your quests and earning your points. If you have any questions for me, I'm at Radio Free Gamer on Twitter or radiofreegamer@gmail.com. If you have any inquiries about paid DMing or DM advice, feel free to email me as well. Thanks again to the group at Left Field Media, and I wish you all the best. Have a good one.